Hi, and welcome to my presentation on nuclear-powered submarines. This slideshow will be covering 1. The history of nuclear-powered submarines, 2. How they work, 3. Why use nuclear power in submarines, and 4. What the decommissioning process is for nuclear-powered submarines. For a long time, power over the seas dictated who had the most power globally as a nation. Up until the 20th century, this power was almost exclusively held by the British Empire. Therefore, submarines were first dreamed of when people thought of ways they might be able to sneak up on British ships and overthrow their monopoly on the seas. The first individual vessel was made in 1620, but the first steam-powered submarine didn't exist until 1867. Submarines had the most use in wars, and it was after World War II that the U.S. shifted focus from nuclear bombs to nuclear power, and this also meant in the context of powering submarines. Although nuclear-powered submarines weren't developed exclusively for the Cold War, this became their use afterwards. On January 21, 1954, almost a century after the launching of the first steam-powered submarine, the first nuclear-powered submarine had its first trip, and it was called the Nautilus. A few years later, this same sub also became the first to sail beneath Arctic ice as it reached the North Pole. Until 1991, when production stopped, the U.S. produced 3 subs a year, and in total 500 vessels have been constructed in America since 1954. The timeline of nuclear-powered submarines followed a similar course globally. The U.S. did share the technology they discovered with Britain. However, France, Russia, and China developed the technology separately. The first Soviet nuclear-powered submarine was operational in 1959, only a few years after the American one, and this was soon followed by the British in 1963, French in 1971, and Chinese in 1974. The first subs made by these countries were only powered by nuclear reactors, but later they soon incorporated nuclear weapons as well, for military purposes. The structural elements of a nuclear submarine are made of THY-80, an alloy made of nickel, molybdenum, and chromium. This is used to protect the sub from the pressure it experiences deep underwater. For the most part, nuclear-powered submarines have the same parts and structure that regular submarines did, the only exception being that they have a nuclear reactor that powers the propeller. As you can see from the diagram, the nuclear reactor and its parts are usually toward the rear of the submarine so that it can directly power the propeller. Like regular submarines, the propeller is still a steam-driven turbine. However, it is powered by the nuclear reactor, as I said. The reactor works so that a neutron is used to split an atom of uranium, which produces energy in the form of gamma radiation and heat. A coil filled with circulating water is superheated and is routed past the reactor. This water is under extremely high pressure, which prevents it from boiling. Inside self-contained piping, the water is directed through a secondary source of water, where it is heated again. Here, the water is converted to steam and is piped toward the turbine that generates power for the submarine. The steam is condensed again in special cooling tubes, and the resulting water flows into the steam generator. Inside the generator, it's reheated and the process repeats. This method requires no oxygen, so the submarine doesn't need to maintain or refresh a supply of air from above the surface. For nuclear-powered submarines, the percentage of uranium enrichment has to be far higher than it is in local power plants, usually around 20 to 45%. The difference between these numbers dictates the amount of time the sub can travel before having to refuel the nuclear reactor. To give you a sense of the size of this machine, a large marine reactor is about 4.6 meters by 1.8 meters. I've already hinted at the reasons nuclear-powered submarines are favored over regular submarines, but I'll summarize them in 3 main points. First of all, they can reach greater depths. Second, travel longer distances at higher speeds. And third, remain underwater indefinitely. All of these abilities are the result of nuclear-powered submarines not needing to stop to refuel like regular diesel-electric engines. They can keep going for years at a time, some lasting from 30 to 40 years. Not only does this make them useful in military applications such as surveillance, but it also has its benefits in research. So far, nuclear-powered submarines have been crucial to analyzing the shape of ice caps for signs of environmental damage, studying the deep-sea creatures and thermal vents found along the ocean's floor, locating old shipwrecks and jet fighters, as well as surveying and mapping the ocean floor in areas like the South and North Pole. All of these abilities makes nuclear-powered submarines seem too good to be true, and in fact they are. Like most things with nuclear reactors, there's a long process to decommissioning them, because of the radioactivity that is involved. At the end of the nuclear-powered submarine's lifespan, the parts surrounding the reactor as well as the reactor itself have become contaminated radioactively. This is when the nuclear-powered submarine is moved to a shipyard, where the reactor is shut down so immediate radioisotopes can decay. After this, it is ready to be dismantled. The last part of the dismantling process is getting rid of the spent fuel. As we know, this is the fuel rods that have decayed. The spent fuel rods are sent to a storage facility, where they are either reprocessed or listed as radioactive waste. Finally, the radioactive reactor compartment is discarded in one of three ways: by sea disposal, shallow land burial, or deep land burial. On the right side, I included a picture of a nuclear reactor for a nuclear-powered submarine being built so you can get an idea of what the process looks like. I had 4 primary takeaways from my research on nuclear-powered submarines. First part is that they are defined by the fact that they are powered by a nuclear reactor instead of a diesel-electric engine. The second is that they were not created because of war, but that is their primary use. The third is that their abilities include reaching greater depths than normal submarines, traveling longer distances at higher speeds, and remaining underwater indefinitely until supplies are needed. Lastly, it is important to note that the decommissioning process for nuclear-powered submarines has become an important problem that has not yet been solved. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something about nuclear-powered submarines.